Well, we are going to talk about sex this morning. I don't know if that, hopefully it doesn't come as a shock to any of you. I mean, we are continuing a series on the Song of Songs, so that was going to come up inevitably. And I'll admit from the beginning that when Joel and I got together and planned out this series, it didn't happen like you think it probably did, where, he's the senior pastor and he doesn't want to preach on sex, so he just assigns it to the poor associate pastor. So now it happened. I asked for this topic. I wanted to preach on sex, though I want to be clear, I would really appreciate it if you direct all your questions to Pastor Joel. So keep that in mind. I did. I wanted to address it. In fact, I feel kind of burdened to address it for two reasons. First, I have realized, just in my own experience with other people, that when we as followers of Jesus talk to people who aren't followers of Jesus about sex, we often end up frustrated. And they often end up, confused, amused, and maybe even angry. And the reason is because we are having fundamentally different conversations. Okay, that's the realization I had. And the reason for that's simple. Look, if you either don't believe or don't care that a wise and loving God made you in his image, imbued you with value and dignity, and redeemed you by his blood, then of course you are going to think about sex differently than we do. Of course you will. And of course, those outside the church are going to find our view of sex odd when they have discarded and disqualified all the reasons why we think about it the way that we do. We don't just disagree about when and with whom and how to have sex, although we often disagree about that too. We actually disagree, and this is important, over the nature and significance of sex itself. It's no wonder that when we have conversations, we think we're talking about the same thing and we're talking about different things. It's no wonder we all often leave confused and frustrated. But this leads me to my second reason for wanting to preach on this topic, which is that I think that means we as followers of Jesus need to learn how to better reframe those conversations, to communicate clearly not only what we believe about sex, but why. But why? A few weeks ago, I was talking with some friends, and we were talking about work and coworkers, and someone just brought up, and kind of a neat moment of honesty, and just said, honestly, one of the things I live in fear of is that my coworkers, knowing who I am, knowing what I believe, and knowing how they live their lives, is going to just look at me just straight out and say, do you really believe that the way I live my life, that's sinful and that I'm going to hell because of that? And the next few minutes were very cool. I kind of just got to stand there and listen as these friends offered just thoughtful, insightful responses to that person, encouraged them. It was cool, just body of Christ ministering to each other. But then as I'm listening, it all of a sudden occurred to me, and I finally said, I think if that happens, I wouldn't answer that question. What I would say is, well, actually, if you want to know what I believe is that a good and loving God made you in his image, and he loves you deeply, and he has done just about everything he can to draw you back to himself. That's what we believe. Let's start there, and we'll get to the other stuff later. Look, of course, our view of sex is harder to understand and harder to appreciate, harder to accept if you just take it and pluck it completely out of our worldview, and you pluck it completely out of the covenant context that, from our point of view, gives it its significance and its meaning. But some of that's on us. We need to get better at reframing that conversation. And sometimes that's going to mean we can't just start with sex, but we have to start with the belief that we are God's good creation, that we bear his image, and that he created the marriage covenant, and that he's the one who calls people to it. I'm convinced that if we do that, we actually have a compelling and beautiful vision for sex, one for which our culture has no answer and no real alternative. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to start with a theology of sex in about 15 minutes or less, all right? So I know But I figure what I have going for me is that might be 15 minutes more on the theology of sex than some of you have had in the rest of your life. So, something's better than nothing maybe, right? But I'd like to do that, and I want to create a sort of theological frame. And my plan is this. Once we create the frame, then I think we can turn our attention to Song of Songs 4. And I think what we see in Song of Songs 4 will then make better sense. It'll be easier for us to understand what's going on. A final note before I get started. I'm indebted to Paul Eddy and David Clark. They're both professors at Bethel, who both spoke brilliantly at a conference on this issue that I attended a few years ago. And honestly, their presentations really gave me a glimpse into what I think is God's great vision for sex. And it changed the way I thought about it in my own life and marriage. And my hope is that I can pass some of that on to you this morning. All right, so let's dive in. So here's the case I'm going to make this morning. I believe God intended for sex to serve as the oath sign of the male-female marriage covenant. All right, it's a little technical. I'm going to unpack it in a bit. I'll even give you some examples later. But here's the bottom line. If you're worried about getting into the theological weeds, I don't have this in the notes, but if I were taking notes, this is the thing I would write down. An oath sign is a participatory act that both expresses and renews the covenant. All right, it's a participatory act, we participate, that both expresses and renews the covenant. So that means, today in our context, that God designed sex to express and to renew the marriage covenant. So let's pry those two apart and talk about what we mean by those. So first, an oath sign is a symbol and expression of the covenant vows. If you look, God makes clear from the very beginning, from Genesis 2 forward, that the marriage covenant is intended fundamentally to be a radical union, a profound oneness for life. So it's right there in the beginning, Genesis 2:24. So right after God makes Eve and Adam looks at her and he recognizes instantly, he says, all right, here we go. This is my partner, this is my equal, made of the same substance, right? He says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. He recognizes here is a co-bearer of God's image with him. Right after Adam recognizes and says all this, the author of Genesis tells us, he kind of waves his hand and says, oh, by the way, reader, if you're wondering, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. They become one flesh. And look, I think it's important to recognize that even today, that's a radical view of the marriage covenant. Many in our culture today who have an otherwise pretty good view of marriage would say that marriage is fundamentally a contract, right? It's a contract for mutual benefit, for self-actualization, and for raising children. You get married because it offers benefits to both of you. But if the day should come when that's no longer true, when it's no longer seeming to offer any further benefit to one or both parties, well, then you call it off. You end the contract. It's a contractual view of marriage. We need to recognize that God's intent for this covenant is different. He intended for marriage to be a lifetime covenant and a radical union, a oneness. So if this is God's intent for the marriage covenant, then it doesn't take a wildly creative mind to see how sex is a particularly appropriate symbol and expression of that covenant reality. It is, in a very literal way, the most intimate physical union between two people. That physical union, God intends to be a symbol and expression of the covenant union. And actually, you can go further. I think that's maybe the foundational point. But it's a symbol and expression in other ways, too. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that God intends for marriage to be a place where we each put the needs of the other before our own. And if you think about sex is a natural physical expression of that reality. Sex just works better when we put the needs of the other person ahead of our own. Sex is or should be a physical expression, a symbol of that self-giving covenant love. Within its covenant context, man, sex is such a beautiful and powerful expression and symbol of that oneness of marriage. It is a physical union that is a symbol of the covenant union and of the vows that established it. So that's number one. An oath sign, sex in this case, is a symbol and expression of that covenant reality, those covenant vows. Second, an oath sign is an ongoing experiential renewal of the covenant vows. So that means when a married couple has sex, they are, with their bodies, participating in an ongoing renewal of their covenant commitment. I love this point, and I think, man, this is one of those things that if we accept it, will transform the way we view sex as married couples, if we let it. All right, in my opinion, one of the most radical articulations of God's vision for the marriage covenant comes from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4. All right, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4, Paul starts out with something that to his audience would have sounded normal and ordinary. He says, wives, you do not have authority over your own bodies. Instead, you have yielded that to your husbands. Now, I got to pause for a second and tell you that today, a lot of you probably heard that and thought, I don't like that. But in Paul's context, everyone, women included, heard that and went, yeah, that's what marriage is. Right? In the Roman world, it was just a common understanding that the man had sort of almost an ultimate authority over his wife and family. So they hear that from Paul and they go, yep, that sounds right. And then Paul does, I think, what is an almost unspeakably radical thing in his world, but at the same time, a very Genesis 2 thing, and I would add, a very kingdom of God thing. Which is then he turns his eye on the husbands and he says, in the same way, not in a similar way, not in an analogous way, not in a related way, in the same way, husbands, you do not have authority over your body, but you yield it to your wife. Man, that's, unspeakably radical then, but I think it's still radical today. And yet, here's my point. It's also perfectly consistent with what God reveals and establishes in Genesis. And what I'm arguing this morning is that God created the act of sex to be an ongoing experiential renewal of that covenant reality. God created sex as a way for husbands and wives to say to each other, I belong to you and to you alone for life. And you belong to me and to me alone for life. And God's vision is that every time we have sex, when we give ourselves physically to each other, we are, through that experience, renewing and reaffirming those vows together. Or, more simply, God built sex into the life of marriage, into the covenant of marriage, so that you would have a private, frequent vow renewal ceremony. Sex is to be an expression of your covenant, and it should renew it at the same time. And can I just say, this is like a side note, but how like our God to make this ongoing covenant renewal a source of pleasure to both people? I think that tells us something deep about our God all by itself. All right, so it's a symbol and expression, and it's an ongoing experiential renewal. Let me give you two quick examples from the Bible of other oath signs that I hope will help tie this together and really drive home what this means. So first, Old Testament, God says explicitly in Exodus, he's made this covenant with the whole nation of Israel. He's rescued them from slavery in Egypt, and he's had this covenant with Abraham and his descendants, and now he's making a new covenant with the whole people. And he says that the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath and making it holy, that is the sign of what we would call the Mosaic covenant. Okay, so what does that mean? How is keeping the Sabbath holy, how is that an expression of that covenant and an experiential renewal? Well, how is it an expression? Well, if you think about it, I think it's pretty clear, right? So here they are. This is his chosen people set apart. When they work for 6 days and rest on the seventh, they are publicly, visibly, obviously communicating, we are identifying ourselves. We are the people of the God of Genesis 1, who for 6 days labored and on the seventh day rested. It is an obvious way of identifying themselves with that God. They are saying, he is our God and we are his people. It's an expression of their covenant with him. But it's also a renewal, because what do they do on the Sabbath? They don't just nap and take the day off. They give that day over to the worship of that God and to the reading of his word. And the idea is that when they keep the Sabbath, it's built into the regular rhythm of their life. Every week they remind themselves, you are our God, we are your people. And then they have this time where they worship him and study his word so that they leave the Sabbath renewed in their commitment to him. That's the purpose. It's the oath sign of that covenant. It expresses and it renews it. All right, one New Testament example, the Lord's Supper. All right, now Jesus never explicitly calls the Lord's Supper the oath sign of the new covenant. But when he explains to his disciples what they're doing, he hits all the definitional points, right? He says, whenever you do this, so it's ongoing, right? Jesus expects they will keep doing it. They'll do it and keep doing it. And it's participatory. When you do it, whatever you do this, do it what? In remembrance of me. It is an expression, an ongoing expression of their covenant relationship with who? With the crucified and risen Messiah. Hence, Jesus says, this bread is my body broken for you. This cup is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus tells them, hey, this isn't accidental. I'm using these two things because they are symbols of my sacrifice that is the foundation of my covenant with you. So when we eat it, what are we doing? It is an expression of our covenant loyalty and faith in Jesus Christ and in his sacrifice. When we partake of that, we are saying to ourselves and to the world, our faith, our hope for salvation, for forgiveness of sins, for the world one day being put right, rests in the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus and that alone. And the idea is that when we participate in that, and I hope you've had this experience, when you participate in that, it's not just an expression, we come out of the other side renewed, reminded, like reaffirmed in our commitment. Yes, this is where I put my faith, and this is where I want my undivided faith to be, in Jesus Christ and in his sacrifice. It is the oath sign, an oath sign of the new covenant. Now look, these aren't maybe perfect, but they hopefully help you understand the idea. And the idea is this: sex is not just a prerequisite for procreation. It's not just for pleasure. It's an expression and ongoing renewal of the marriage covenant. It's a physical reflection of the covenant union that at the same time is intended to strengthen that covenant union. That's the theological frame that Scripture provides for sex. Okay, I know we got to get to Song of Songs. So how does this frame help us? Does it have anything to say specifically about how we should approach sex with our spouse? Well, the answer to that is yes. As we've already seen, sex is meant to reflect and renew the covenant. So that means it needs to actually reflect, express God's intent for the covenant. And real quick, just a couple examples of that. We have sort of a specific thing we're going to talk about this morning, but I just want you to see how this can be helpful in other ways. When people bring up or consider, and we have to acknowledge, as uncomfortable as it is, ways of having sex that are abusive, that cause pain, that are demeaning to one or both people involved, just bring that to the frame. Is there any place in that frame for those behaviors? There's no place. And it becomes obvious because that is a betrayal of the marriage covenant. It doesn't express the marriage covenant God lays out. It makes a mockery of it. There's no place for that kind of activity in a Christian view of sex, right? What about unfaithfulness, sex outside the covenant of marriage? Is there any place for that in the frame we laid out? No, there isn't. Any sex outside of that covenant, it's a lie. It's a lie to the other person. It's a lie to ourselves. It's us pretending that this is an expression of a commitment. It's not real. And when people say to us, yeah, but it's an expression of our love for each other, we would say, our view gives sex more significance than that. There's other ways to express love. This is to be an expression of a deep covenant commitment, not just love, but of the covenant commitment. That doesn't fit in our frame. So there's no place for it in the Christian life, all right? But today, we're going to see some positive examples, and when we looked at Song of Songs chapter 4. So turn to me there now, and we'll look at some examples of things that do fit in the frame. So if you remember from previous weeks, there's been a progression, right? From courtship early in the book to the marriage, the wedding in chapter 3, and now in chapter 4 we get to what we have called the wedding night, to sex, right? And again, I'll remind you, though you probably don't need it, this is poetry, okay? This is not a graphic description of sex, nor is it a treatise on the mechanics of sex. It's poetry, so we need to read and understand it through that lens. But I think that if we listen to the poetry, we find an approach to sex that fits beautifully within the frame that God has provided. So look first, if you would, chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. It says this, "You have stolen my heart, my sister, my bride. You have stolen my heart with one glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. How delightful is your love, my sister, my bride. How much more pleasing is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your perfume more than any spice." Now first, I feel like I just have to say, it's weird probably for you to read "my sister, my bride," but that is a poetic expression in their world. What's actually happening there in their world, the strongest commitment is the blood commitment of the nuclear family. And so what that actually is there is a way of them saying to each other when they include the sibling language, my commitment to you, my tie to you is as strong as the blood tie of a brother and sister. It is for life, and it cannot be broken, right? So it's weird to us. That's what's going on there. But beyond that, the main thing I want to hit here, it's an important and obvious point, but I think I want to admit, sometimes this has been lost, and lost even within our own stream of faith, is this. God intended for sex to bring delight. He intended for sex to bring delight. He gave it as a way for us to delight in one another and to experience joy together. This couple in chapter 4 delights in one another. It's impossible to miss, mostly because they tell each other all the time. Now look, I know this is a sermon about sex, not about necessarily marriage more generally, but free marriage tip here, maybe try telling your spouse every once in a while, regularly, that you delight in them, that it is a pleasure and a joy to be loved by them. Just a tip, that's all. But sex is to be an expression of that delight that you have in one another. This isn't the only purpose of marriage. It's not even the greatest purpose, but it is part of God's design. And good sex, theologically speaking, should express that delight and renew it. That's number one. Number two, sex should be characterized by mutuality and mutual self-giving. Look down at verses 4:16 through 5:1. "Awake, north wind, and come, south wind. Blow on my garden, that its fragrance may spread everywhere. Let my beloved come into his garden and taste its choice fruits. I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I have drunk my wine and my milk." Now, I chose these two verses because they put, I think, the self-giving nature of sex at the forefront. But really, this self-giving love characterizes the entire book. If you just read through, you'll find it everywhere. In fact, what you find, if you remember from previous weeks, is that this book, all over the place, what do we find? mutual delight, mutual self-giving, mutual desire, mutual joy, mutual longing. So let me just come out and say it bluntly, because, maybe that'll be helpful. God did not intend for sex to be a gift to men that women endure, or vice versa. God gave sex as a good gift to the couple, to both. And I'll say it one more time. Sex is meant to express and renew the mutuality and the self-giving that should characterize the marriage covenant. Ephesians 5 tells us that in marriage, we are each to put the other before ourselves. We are each to serve the other. We're each to submit to the other. We are each to love and to respect the other. That's our frame for sex, and good sex will express that covenant mutuality and self-giving, and good sex should renew it. It should renew it. And it really can renew it. If we approach it correctly, we can have sex and leave with a renewed desire to love and serve the person that we are married to. I mentioned earlier that what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:4 about our spouse having authority over our body. Look down quickly at Song of Songs 6:3. I knew I was preaching on this. First thing I did is I just read through the whole book. It's a short book. It's easy to do. And I got to this, and a little flag went up, right? So I get to this verse in chapter 6, verse 3. Listen to what the beloved says. She says, I am my lover's, and my lover is mine. You know what I see there? For this young couple, sex was both an expression of their covenant love, and it strengthened it. I know this is going to sound weird to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. In their case, good sex produced Pauline theology about the marriage covenant. All right? That's what I'm sticking with here. Because the result of it was it strengthened their desire for their marriage to be a place of mutual self-giving love. And that's exactly what God intends. It's exactly what God intends. And if we've been paying attention to God's design, that shouldn't surprise us. Sex is meant to be an expression of that mutual self-giving. And in the joy and pleasure it provides, sex should strengthen and renew our desire for that commitment. All right, that's number 2. Number 3, God intended sex to reflect and to renew the intimacy and exclusivity of marriage. Look, intimacy fundamentally is about knowledge. It's about knowing someone else deeply. We may never know someone else fully, but intimacy is that pursuit. I say often that one of the most wonderful, surprising joys of marriage is to have the experience to be in a situation where you realize that the person who knows you best, most fully, and that includes all your flaws, all the things I'm embarrassed of, all the things I make an effort to hide from other people out of embarrassment or shame. The person who knows all those things about me is also the person who loves me the most. I mean, that is a humbling, powerful experience. It's a beautiful gift. And it's one that I am certain is meant to be a glimpse of God's own knowledge of and love for us. And God intended sex to be specifically an expression of that intimacy and exclusivity and to renew and strengthen it. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I will say this. Because we need to get better at articulating this. This, friends, is one of the great blessings and joys of monogamy. To have this physical act that belongs to the two of you and the two of you alone. Here is an expression of physical intimacy, of deep intimacy, a physical knowledge of one another that no one else shall share until death do you part. Look with me at chapter 4, verse 12. Now, I'll reference back to the verses we just read, but this comes before. The lover says to his beloved, "You are a garden, locked up, my sister, my bride. You are a spring enclosed, a sealed fountain." Then she comes back and says, "Let my beloved come into his garden and taste its choice fruits. And then he says what? I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. So notice how both take up this theme, this image of the garden, it might be literal, it also might be, probably is metaphorical here, a metaphor for sex. But we already saw, this is a metaphor for how they give themselves to each other. It's a way they talk about that. But notice how verse 12 adds a new layer to this. Because the beloved says the lover says that his beloved is a garden locked up. And that her only invitation is for him. In fact, he can say now, he does say appropriately, given what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, that her garden, that she is a garden locked up. He can say, when she invites him, he can rightly say, I have come into my garden. In fact, they can both say that because they each now belong to the other. That is the covenant reality that sex is meant to express and renew. Sex is a gift only for each other. It is an act of intimacy and an expression of that relational intimacy that should characterize the marriage covenant and also strengthen it. All right, I know I'm going to go a little long here, but I hope you'll bear with me. And look, we don't talk about sex that often, all right? So cut me some slack. So now that we have this frame and these three insights, I want to take a minute just to reinforce one more time how I think God wants this to work and fit together. Within the covenant of marriage, the marriage context, God designed sex to be an expression. So think of it this way. You've got your marriage covenant. Sex is to be an expression, an outflow of the love and commitment of the marriage covenant. But God is so brilliant and wonderful and good that this expression, this outflow, also then is supposed to amplify. It does amplify and renew that commitment at the same time. So it's an expression of our delight in one another, and it amplifies our delight in one another. It is an expression of that mutual self-giving love, and it should amplify that mutual self-giving love. It's an expression of that intimacy and exclusivity, and it should amplify it. Can you see how beautifully God designed that? How powerful that is if we will do it the way God designed it. Now that, I suggest to you this morning, that is a glorious and beautiful vision for human sexuality. It's a vision that imbues sex itself with deep significance, and at the same time, it insists on a profound dignity for the people who participate in it. So here's what struck me this week. It really struck me. All of a sudden I start thinking about how our culture views it, and I was genuinely heartbroken. I'm just sad. I think, so often we get defensive or angry at how culture treats sex, and I understand that too. But I think we also should take a moment to recognize it should grieve us. It grieves God. They have taken this beautiful, incredible gift, this amazing design where it's an expression and amplifier of our covenant love, and they've demeaned it. All right? If you listen to how people talk about it, it is so nihilistic, as though sex means nothing, or it's utterly selfish. It's only about you pursuing your own pleasure. But here's the thing, and I believe this. I think people are hungry. They are hungry for a more beautiful vision, but they do not know where to look, because no one else has one. But we do. My hope this morning is that may God help us to be courageous examples and ambassadors of a more excellent way. All right, let me close with this. I want to close by asking, what does this look like for us? Or in other words, if you've been with us the last 2 weeks, what are your assignments, all right, for the next week? Joel said he was anxious to hear what sort of assignments I would come up with after this sermon. So I'm sorry, I've got 3 for different groups, all right? All right, but here you go. If you are young and unmarried but planning to get married, let me say to you just as directly as I possibly can, There are just so few things that I can recommend so universally and with such complete confidence as this. So here it is, teens, my children, all right? Wait until you are married to have sex, because God created sex to be the oath sign for marriage. And then when you get married, commit together to making sex a meaningful expression and renewal of your covenant vows. Make it an expression and renewal of the covenant love God intended for it to be. I promise you, I have no qualms about this. I promise you that you will never regret it, and that it will enrich your marriage and your sex life. That's that group. Now, if you are currently unmarried in this season or chapter of life, so this might include teens and young people, but it's bigger than that, and you are striving to be obedient to God in this area, and listen, I know that this is a hard area to be faithful. I just want to say thank you to you. This is one of the ways that you live out your covenant faithfulness to Jesus. And I remember, this is a hard path to walk. But just hear me. You make all of us, you make the whole church more credible when you choose to be faithful to Jesus in that way. And we are indebted to you. And let me just say, I remember what it was like to be 17 and just chock full of hormones. I desperately needed, and I was fortunate to have people like you in my life that I could look to as examples. And our teens, our young people, they desperately need those examples too. Listen, I knew plenty of people my age when I was 17 who were having sex and who told me it was fun and it's no big deal. Why was I worried about it? I didn't need everyone to agree with me. I just needed a couple people that I admired, who I could look to, who could prove to me that it was possible to be obedient to Jesus in this area, and who might even bother to tell me that it could be deeply fulfilling. If that is you and you are doing that for our church body, I just want to say thank you. Sorry, thinking of my kids. So no homework for you this week. If you've been called to marriage, here's your assignment. It might be awkward for some of you. Have a conversation about this. Talk together about how to integrate this frame, this biblical theological frame for sex, maybe even some of the examples from Song of Songs, into your marriage and sex life. Think about what you can do or say to make sex a meaningful expression and renewal of your covenant vows. I promise you, it'll be well worth it.